All right, you guys. Well, thank you for coming once again. Super exciting to be back with everybody for another Armchair Exploration series. Today we're going to have Dan Olsen. He's going to be giving a talk called Mom Knows Best, Killer Whale Culture. And before I introduce Dan, I'm just going to go through a couple of the nuts and bolts, which everybody knows already, but I'll just hit them real quick. We're going to be putting everybody on mute, so we do ask that you remain on mute for the duration of the presentation. If you hover over the bottom of your Zoom screen, you'll find your video and mute settings, as well as the chat function. If you have any questions for Dan during the presentation, you can enter them into the chat, and the Zegrahm team will be sure to address those questions at the end of the talk. And then additionally, there will be time at the end if you want to unmute yourself and then ask Dan some questions at that time. Dan will be going into presenter mode, which he's already in, so you should see a slide that has a killer whale on there that says Mom Knows Best, Killer Whale Culture with Dan Olsen. If you can't see that slide, let us know, and the Zegrahm team can do our best to help you out over the chat to get things sorted out. So a little bit about Dan. Dan is a whale biologist who lives in Seward, Alaska. Technically, Dan calls Seward his home, but he also spends a lot of time in Homer and some time in Anchorage. And on occasion, he pops down to Washington State where he can visit his family. While in Seward, Dan lives on his sailboat. And then George, who I know is on this call with me, and myself, we've been lucky enough to go on a few sailing adventures with Dan out of Resurrection Bay, and it's just super stunning up there. They really have a beautiful spot, and Dan has a special thing going with living on his sailboat. He spent many years teaching outward bound courses in mountaineering, sailing, and kayaking in Alaska, Washington, Florida, and Mexico. He honed his maritime skills on multiple tall ships, splicing and tying lines, climbing the rigging, and furling sails. He then spent many years as a boat captain in Kenai Fjords National Park. Dan began recording killer whales in 2004 and was hooked when he learned that families could be identified by their calls. He achieved a fisheries biology master's degree from the University of Alaska Fairbanks and is now a partner in a nonprofit dedicated to monitoring the health of Alaska killer whale populations. So although Dan's specialty is in acoustics and he spends a good deal of time listening with an underwater hydrophone to identify specific killer whale families by their dialects, he also studies diet and behavior and is always excited to find some whale poo. Dan recently presented for the BBC production of Alaska Wild Live, so you can check that out. Dan has worked for us as an onboard expert, giving talks on killer whales, obviously, but also on a variety of other things such as sailing, navigation, and astronomy. He leads trips to the Arctic and Antarctic as an expedition leader. And as the cruise director, working alongside Dan, a lot of times I can tell you that he has a knack for making me and the rest of the staff laugh at just the right moments. Anyone who's traveled with Dan has probably enjoyed a lot of belly laughs and been involved in his after-dinner sea shanty sing-alongs in the lounge. So at this time, I'd like to give a warm welcome to all of you and turn things over to my good friend Dan for his talk, Mom Knows Best, Killer Whale Culture.
All right. Hello, everybody. I'm assuming you can see my screen and see me here in Homer in our office. Can you see both those things? There should be a little slider in between the two if you want to make me smaller and the slide bigger. Or
wait, are you the big black and white thing there?
You don't have to state your reason why you'd want to do one or the other. My name is Dan Olsen. I want to talk to you about killer whale culture. I use the term killer whale a lot. If you want to use the term orca, that's fine. You're just using more recent slang. And we can talk about that some other time. Scientific name is killer whale. Since I have to write scientific papers, I'm saying killer whale all the time in an official science sense. If you can see my shirt, it's not Alaska appropriate today. It's 35 degrees and raining in Homer. Hi, Rika. We're both in Homer, but COVID makes it quite tough to get together. But this shirt, there's no other shirt in my life that brings me back more to Zegrahm. I looked in the closet this morning, knew immediately I had to wear it. And many of you have seen it. I want to say hi, Dick, say hello to Frank, and see that Dave and Sue are here, and Ethel and Gail and Sandy, so many people that we've sailed with. We want to do it again, and I'm sure quite a few of you have seen this shirt. Its origin came when I lost my luggage in Papeete, Tahiti, and I guess I could say it's the one time that losing my luggage gave me great joy, and it somehow, the lost luggage shirts kept on appearing all over the world, including here in Svalbard, where we polar plunged north of the Arctic Circle, north 81 degrees north, next to the sea ice, with blue whales and harp seals galore. But we will get back into the other fun stuff here. I am the research director for the North Gulf Oceanic Society. We are a small nonprofit and have been studying killer whales in Alaska since at least 1984 is how far back our data sheets go. Craig Matkin was working with them far before that, while he was fishing in the Sound. And to talk about killer whales, I really need to introduce you to a mother. This is AT9, or Chinega. She is a transient, but that really should be called a mammal specialist, because the term transient doesn't really fit. It's not a great name. But I was running a tour boat back in 2004 when I saw this animal, didn't know which animal it was, made a recording, and I was just getting into acoustics at the time, and I heard these calls. Which to me sound a little bit lonely, a little bit wailing. And that's the call that this family uses to get in touch with the rest of its pod. When I heard that first, I didn't believe it. I made the recording. I played the recording to Craig and Eva, who were researching at the time I was running tours. Eva came back over the radio, marine radio, and said, "Oh, that's one of the AT1s trying to get in touch with the rest of its pod." And I was like, yeah, right, there's no way. And sure enough, I left, ran into two other whales. Craig and Eva came up, photographed the one, they knew who it was, and in a moment, they were all three together. It was who she thought it was, because she'd done her whole master's on that pod, her master's degree, and they did regroup after that. And I was blown away, and I was hooked. There was no going back. I went down to Vancouver, BC to study at Orca Lab, learn the calls of the BC residents, and spent a lot of time at the Vancouver Aquarium learning the dialects of our Alaskan killer whales, because a lot of the research had been done down there. Unfortunately, Chinega and her group, the AT1, swam through the oil spill. Chinega herself maybe didn't, but because she's still alive, but a large group swam through the oil spill, as well as another pod of residents, which should be called fish specialists, salmon specialists. They swam right through the oil spill in '89. And in the next year, the AT1s lost 9 members. The AB pod lost more than that, but the AB pod has since been recovering. They've been having calves and reproducing and growing as a pod, whereas the AT1 group has not had a calf since before the oil spill. And of course, hydrocarbons, other pollutants that we put in the water often mess with reproductive abilities of humans and other animals. And so the AT1 group is on the road to extinction. Here's all of them. There used to be 22 of them when the study first began. Now there's 7. We did get photos of all 7 again this year. It's been 7 for quite a while now, but they lost 9 individuals in that year and a half after the oil spill. And if anyone needs any good reading, we've got Eva Salidas' book, In the Great Silence. She is the researcher that told me that identified those calls for me back in 2004. We lost Eva in 2015. And as she was battling cancer, she wrote this amazing and vulnerable book about watching her study animal pod in decline towards extinction as she was facing her own mortality. And really quite an open and vulnerable read. It's excellent. And I like the title Integrate Silence, because as we think about these calls that are passed down through generation and made only by that family, these calls are no longer going to be heard as those animals die out. The whole soundscape of Prince William Sound will indeed change. I'd like to talk about cultural transmission, because that's the most fascinating thing about these animals. These are social animals. They live with their families their whole lives. They'll live with their mothers their whole lives, learn from their mother, learn from their grandmother. And we see it in a lot of social animals where cultural transmission is a process of passing on information that is learned socially, learned from a mother, learned from your family group. And we see that in killer whales. It's also observed in chimpanzees and bonobos and gorillas and elephants, dolphins and sperm whales. Hal Whitehead is an incredible sperm whale researcher. He likes to use a definition which is essentially the same: culture is information or behavior acquired by social learning, shared by members of a group. And he's done amazing things with sperm whales, looking at their echolocation codas, or signals that they send out that are kind of a clan membership identifier. There's been amazing literature out recently. If you need some more reading, man, Franz de Waal, Carl Safina, Cy Montgomery have some amazing books about animal cognition. Again, the social animals: elephants, chimpanzees, bonobos, killer whales, pilot whales, sperm whales, but also I'm reading The Soul of an Octopus right now about animal intelligence. But birds are very intelligent. Yes, Vegano, it's true. Birds are very intelligent, and as we know, dogs are quite intelligent as well. And as we look more closely at our brains and our emotions and their emotions, there's the similarities are building and building upon what we find from them. And in science as well. Here's a couple of papers, one from Hal Whitehead about culture in whales and dolphins, and Harold Yerk, who I worked with a bit, wrote a paper a long time ago about cultural transmission and the call types that we see in Alaska pass through generations, and I'll talk about those a little bit later. But
Hey,
we
Dan,
see cultural.
Dan,
Yes,
Dan,
go ahead.
Can I just cut in? If anyone hasn't seen the movie My Octopus Teacher, it's a brilliant film that shows just how intelligent octopuses are. So highly recommended. It's called My Octopus Teacher.
Excellent. Thank you. Yeah, My Octopus Teacher. Yeah, there's octopi are incredibly intelligent. Escaping from their enclosures, opening puzzles and traps, and stealing fish sneakily from other tanks in the aquariums and things like that. But for us with killer whales, it's really cool that we see this cultural transmission in a few ways. We see diet splits, which end up forming different ecotypes. Here we talk about residents, transients, offshores, or fish specialists, mammal specialists, and shark specialists. But even in Antarctica, those of you who've been there, we have the type A, type B, type C. So these different ecotypes that branch out based on diet initially. We also see that certain families use specific rubbing beaches to rub their bellies on the gravel on the beach in very shallow water. And we see the same families going to the same fishing and hunting spots over and over, and we see the same families using the same calls, which are our family identifiers. So a quick reminder, briefer, if you've seen me talk about killer whales before, many of you have, but these three types are only in the North Pacific. You won't find these three types in the Antarctic or the Atlantic. And if you have a fish-eating killer whale in those places, it's not necessarily related to residents. So these terms only apply to the North Pacific. We have salmon specialists who've only been seen eating fish, never taking a mammal. Vice versa for the Biggs killer whale or transients, the mammal specialists take seals, porpoise, sea lions, whales, other whales sometimes. And then we have a type of offshore. And A couple years ago, I got this photo of a killer whale with an 8-foot salmon shark in its mouth. And the lowest picture is a liver I pulled out of the water, a 4-foot liver from a sleeper shark that was likely 10 or 12 feet long. We do have shark specialist killer whales in Alaska, and well, in British Columbia, Washington, all the way to Russia. They focus on sharks, different than the type that focuses on skates and rays in New Zealand, and different than the types that might take sharks in other parts of the world. But we'll get to there. Here are some of the killer whale types of killer whales around the world. And if you have your chat bar open, or feel free to open your chat bar and go ahead and type in a country or a region of the world that you've seen killer whales in your life. And I'm sure it's been on a Zegrahm trip, because we see killer whales on our Zegrahm trips. At least we look for them. We've had really good fortune over time. I'm seeing the Antarctic and the San Juan Islands. That's great. I remember a Zegrahm trip in Norway. We saw them. Another Zegrahm trip between Greenland and Iceland. Of course, the Antarctic and South Africa, Argentina. What's interesting about all these places that you're seeing killer whales is that they are different types of killer whales. And the leading geneticists are not ready to call them different species yet. If they were birds, they'd have been split already. I'm certain of it, but the leading killer whale geneticists aren't quite ready to split them. But these two panels, we have Northern Hemisphere on your left screen with the males a little bit larger than the females, the Southern Hemisphere. And so starting on the left, the top is, if you can see my cursor, is the residents or the salmon specialists. Then the pack ice, the seal specialists that wash seals off the ice in Antarctica. Then scratch that last bit. That second one are the transients that are taking mammals up here in the North Pacific. Bad, Dan. Offshores are the shark specialists. In the North Atlantic, we have a small and large form. Small form taking mostly herring and fish, and Atlantic salmon, large form taking mostly seals, but they do have a little crossover there in the Atlantic in diet. And then Antarctic type A with whales and big seals. B, these are the ones that take seals off the ice. The Gerlache killer whales take penguins, and they may take other things. We don't know, it's not as well studied, but they've definitely been seen taking penguins. And then the type C, Ross Sea killer whales taking fish. And type Ds, we know very little about, but we think they take fish because they follow long line vessels around. And if you see recent news articles about the type Ds, scientists found new species. Well, we've known about them for a long, long time. The difference is that one leading researcher finally got on a boat and saw them himself, and they did get good biopsy samples and photographs, recordings, and other samples. So we understand a lot more this year about these animals than we did before, but that type is not new to science, and we're not quite ready to call it a species yet. But this is interesting. Look at, I've circled the fish-eating types in different ocean basins. They're not related to each other necessarily. Those diet splits have happened independently, but they're all smaller. So, think of it this way. If you want to be a salmon or a fish specialist, you might have to be more agile and smaller. Whereas we know for some of those, like our transients that ram prey, we see them ramming dolphins, porpoise, or seals, and they actually have thicker jawbones, thicker skulls, and therefore may be adapted physically, not only socially and acoustically, to their prey item. For any predator-prey relationship, of course, it's in fine balance. You got to be the best at what you're doing to survive in the wild. And so oftentimes people say, oh, why don't the transients just take fish? Why don't the residents just take mammals? I don't think they can succeed in doing this, at least to pack on enough blubber to survive the winter, because it's expensive being a killer whale. You have a huge brain, which burns a lot of calories, and you have, George knows about that. You got that big brain, big head, big hair, you got to burn a lot of calories. And if you're a killer whale, you have a large, robust body that doesn't move through the water very efficiently compared with other whales and dolphins. And you have a large brain, one of the second largest in the world. And so it's an expensive animal calorically. And so you got to be right on the prime. And so I think we see this specialization. Now that's not true worldwide. In the tropics, you do certainly have ones that eat fish and mammals because they can't afford to specialize there. But in the far north and the far south, you're going to have specialists, and they're going to outcompete any that aren't trying to specialize. So I want to shift from the types into some of where we see culture in terms of the diet and fishing spots that we see locally here in Alaska. And this, what I'm about to focus on now is true for Washington State, San Juan Islands, British Columbia, Alaska, and very likely Kamchatka and Japan are very similar for these. We see the same pods using the same areas year after year. They show up at the same time, and they're feeding on the same things. And this family to family generational learning is important in all that. So much so that having a grandmother around is actually important to their survival. There's actually a science paper out on that where they found that if a grandmother was present in the pod, then the juveniles had a higher success rate in survival. And another science paper, Brianna Wright had a nice paper about kin sharing, where she looked at how many times a mom shared with her calf that was the most common, but also grandmothers sharing with a grand offspring, sharing salmon was very common, where they hold the head and the calf bites off the tail. Siblings share. Interestingly, the males don't share very much. They're kind of off on their own, feeding on their own, not that's so surprising, right? Anyway, enough about the males. Those males, you see the tall dorsal fin, the big 6-foot dorsal fin. It's easy to assume that 6-foot dorsal fin there is the leader of the pack. It is not. That is a giant mama's boy. This is his mother right here. And he will swim with his mother his entire life. And the only time that mating happens is when multiple pods get together. So we call it a super pod. And then the males cross over to some other pod. But at the end of the day, they're back home with mom at mom's house, not sharing food. Classic. Next step, I really need to introduce you to two more mothers. We talked about Chinega, the transient mother who got me roped and hooked into all this. And here we have, I want to compare Stellar AK-16 to Lou AK-17. These are both salmon specialists or residents. And they're both in the AK pod, but the AK pod split in the mid-90s. And Stellar had her mother, grandmother to her offspring. Stellar had her mother with her as she had her first and second calves. She's now 20 years old and has 3 living offspring, and they're all doing well. And we're getting to watch them grow up. Lou, unfortunately, has a really a rough history. Her mother died before she got pregnant or had a calf, and she started swimming a little separately from her sister, like still a quarter mile away, but we'd often see her sister and those calves. And then Lou and her brother Hy would swim kind of separately a little bit. And then in the same year, Lou had already lost her mother. The same year she lost her brother and she got pregnant. And at some point in there, she made the decision to switch over to the cousins. She started swimming with Stellar in that group. And not with her sister. And that's really rare, actually. But she's still swimming with her cousins, who were essentially the same pod, but had split 10 years before. Lou did not have her mother available. She was swimming with her aunts and with her cousin, and didn't have that direct grandmother link. And she's lost 2 calves. She lost one in 2015, 2018. So it's easy for us to think about these animals as just race around the ocean, eat whatever you want, king of the world and queen of the world, sorry. And yet some of these fine-tuned points, multi-generational learning, having grandmother available, both for cultural knowledge and for sharing fish, are actually indeed really important for the survival ability of these animals. We are hoping that next year we'll see Lou with the calf, and then maybe she'll get some help with Stellar, or we'll finally figure it out after more years of watching her cousins and her aunts in the feeding process. Now this gets interesting. We do a lot of collection of samples out in the field, and yet again, another Alaska day there where this shirt is not Alaska appropriate. Although there are days where I do wear this shirt. It's quite nice. There's my buddy Tony scooping up some salmon scales. Basically, we watch for feeding behavior, feeding events. And there's El Dorado, one of the AKs, a male, off swimming, feeding on his own. And you notice how he's turning and diving at the same time. And when we see that, we're pretty sure they're chasing a fish. And in that lower frame, you can actually see a salmon about to get munched by a killer whale, that dark looming shadow. When we see those things happening, we go right in and look for salmon scales. And if, for example, if a calf comes racing in towards mother or grandmother, then we know they might share a fish. And sometimes we see hundreds of scales after they've just taken a bite and ripped a salmon in half. And we collect as many as we can. Sometimes we can only get one scale. They sink slowly. They're shimmering. We lose sight of them. We scoop 5 or 10 if we can, often 2 or 3. And then we send those to the lab. And from salmon scales, you can actually get not only the age of the salmon, but the sex of the salmon, the species of the salmon, and what river that salmon came from. So we get a tremendous amount of data from that, as well as observing, was it the mom who shared with the calf, or was there sharing at all, and information like that, which is really interesting. The location of our salmon scale collection has been really informative. I've colored all of the Chinook salmon scales, the king salmon, Chinook salmon scales, purple in this graph. And you can notice how they're in very specific locations. And the orange dots are chum, and the gray dots and gray circles are coho salmon. So you notice that there's very specific things about the locations. And this location right here with this huge cluster of purple, it happens to be a very easy place for us to get samples. That's part of why there's so many there. But between May 15th and June 15th every year, the same 4, 5, 6 groups of killer whales come to that spot. It's the same families, they're related, they know each other well, and they're feeding on Chinook salmon during that time. But sometimes they disappear overnight, and we've learned later they're getting chum offshore here, where you see fewer scales, but it's harder for us to go out in the open ocean and find these tiny little salmon scales floating in the water. It's much more calm in the inshore waters there. But you can see a little bit of geographic spread. So we're looking at their diet, but it's also points at how these pods are using specific locations, and they have for years, year after year after year, as they're in natural patterns. We don't just see random pods showing up to that location in Agnes Cove every year. We see the same pods over and over again. And same up here, where you see a lot of feeding going on in Hinchley Entrance. It's different pods, but from year to year, it's consistently the AJ and AI and AB pods there, whereas Agnes here is AD and AK pods primarily. So you definitely see habits there. There were some years we put satellite tags on these animals, and we saw the same thing Here's ABAIAJ pod. They were the only pods to go out and use this kayak island area that we observed from the satellite tagging. Hingebrook entrance is very important to them. Montague Strait was important for multiple pods, but more important for them, whereas these ADs and AKs seem to use closer to shore and way up into these inlets at times as well. And there's a science paper I put out a couple of years ago, just looking at how those pods were specifically using different areas. Lately, we've been collecting poop from killer whales, which is very exciting. That is an unusually large find for us. We often find these tiny little bits. But what we can get from the fecal samples from the scat is we can get their the DNA of the prey. So that scat will show us how much Chinook salmon or chum salmon or coho salmon or halibut that animal has been eating probably about 24 hours prior, we think is the digestive time there for us to get it. But we can get the host DNA, and we can get the DNA of the prey, and actually eventually we end up mapping out each individual, and now we very often know which animal, which killer whale that's coming from, because it'll have the host DNA in there. Now this was really fascinating. This was really cool. May 29th, 2018, we were out and we just happened to be able to collect a lot of scat. Sometimes you put in hours and hours and hours and hours and not find any, and then other times, we've had times where we got 8 or 9 samples in a day. And this day in particular was really interesting because a mother and calf, capra and striation, had very similar breakdown in their scat. The results we got back from the lab were about 70% chum, 10 to 20% halibut, and 15 to 20% Chinook. That was for mother and calf. And that's cool because it indicates that they were sharing all their catches in that moment, or a day before, or 24 hours before. Whereas the same day, same pod, these are siblings. These are all siblings to capra. These are all males, and it was mostly all Chinook, chum salmon with a little bit of Chinook and halibut. So quite an interesting difference there. And we don't have enough data to say that male diet's different than female diet, but on that particular day, the mother and calf had a very similar diet, and these other males had a different diet. Is the take home there, once again, going to the importance of this relationship with the mother and learning what you eat from your mother, learning how to catch a fish from your mother, and all these things is very interesting. Overall, our diet information shows somewhere around 40% Chinook salmon and 30% chum and 30% coho, and then a little bit of halibut and flounder. Almost no pink salmon, and essentially no pink salmon or herring, very little sockeye salmon. So very specific diet to the large salmon species. Chinook, chum, coho are the most important diet pieces there. Another way we see culture coming out is through beach rubbing. And I don't know how many of you have ever been so lucky. It's not common to see it. Maybe you've seen it in British Columbia, but I'm gonna play you a quick beach rubbing recording of, this is what it sounds like for a 6 or 8 cent animal to hit the gravel on a beach. Which is pretty cool. We don't know why. We think maybe a spa run, exfoliate a little bit, but it could also be a social event. It could be a tradition, almost a semi-religious tradition kind of thing, where there have been animal groups around the world that have been seen doing certain things that don't necessarily benefit them in terms of their diet or physiologically, and so it could help them get skin off, but it could also just be a social tradition, because we don't see all pods doing it. It's been seen in British Columbia, it's been seen here, if you've heard about animals going up on the beach in Argentina or the Crozet Islands, chances are good or New Zealand, chances are good that's chasing prey. That's not just rubbing. These animals have no prey there. They're just going in and rubbing on gravel beaches. And we don't exactly know why, but we do see the same pods over and over again at these same beaches. And how long has this been going on? We have no idea. It could be tens of thousands of years. But in 1918, there was an artist from New York named Rockwell Kent. He did all the illustrations for Moby Dick. And a really fascinating artist. He lived on Fox Island in Resurrection Bay, right by Seward, for a winter. He went out to do art, took his son, 1918, 1919, and painted scenes of killer whales being close to the beach, but more importantly, wrote in his journal that sometimes the killer whales would come in water so shallow.
Available for your meetings, webinars, and your Zoom rooms.
I'm getting feedback noise from somebody there, but back in 1918, these same pods rubbing on the same beaches in Resurrection Bay. It's a tradition that's been going on a long time, which is pretty cool. Now, which animal is smarter? I don't know if we have any cognitive psychologists or any brain surgeons in the group, but some interesting things. The sperm whale has the largest brain on the planet. The killer whale has the second largest. But of course, we know that absolute size is not important because elephants have a huge brain, and humans have a very high degree of cognitive function. But here's an interesting thing to point out is that you notice how much more folding and twisting the dolphin brain has. And this is, I believe this is from a bottlenose dolphin, but a killer whale brain and a pilot whale brain look very similar. That's called herification or cortical folding. And what that allows for is it allows a much higher degree of gray matter. And so there's a lot of possibility for a higher amount of, a higher count of neurons. Humans have about 20 billion neocortical neurons. Pilot whales have 37 billion, as opposed to that 20 billion for us. Killer whales have 43 billion neocortical neurons. You know, we're not probably going to know in my generation which of these animals is smarter, but I can tell you this, that the cognitive capacity is amazing. And the reason why is probably one of two things or both. So that they're a social animal, because all the social animals we know are intelligent, because of the social nuances, reading personalities, reading each other. We know that chimpanzees anticipate the politics of other chimpanzees and things. And the other is echolocation and interpretation of acoustic signals. So the transition into acoustics. And for killer whales, we see echolocation, like a bat. Even blind people can echolocate, making clicks that bounce off things, come back, so that you know where fish are. You can even navigate that way, islands and cliff walls and things. Killer whales also have whistles, and killer whales have family-specific pulse calls, and I'll play some of those for you. Different than other species because the large whales like fin whales and blue whales use their calls mainly for mating and finding mates from long distances, really low frequency. Killer whales, these calls are pod identifiers, so they're running around shouting their last name. This pod that you see here on the screen is the AK pod, and you're going to hear this call from them a lot. And that call only belongs to that pod, the AK6s, but a variation of that call, almost identical, belongs to the AK2s, their cousins. Very, very similar. But then different pods have some extremely different calls. Some which some which actually sound a lot like aliens and just might be. So these pulse calls are family specific. It's like they're running around shouting their last name, Pagin, 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 essentially, which can be used in close proximity to know where your family members are, but also could be used in a large social gathering. We've had gatherings as large as 150 animals from 10 pods on a research trip I was on. And when that happens, they're listening for the sexy foreign accent. And when they hear the sexy foreign accent, that probably is likely to instill a little bit of a mating urge. I had a paper just come out this year, not so much about the sexy foreign accent, but it was about social behavior, which we believe is related to reproductive behavior, just really hard to prove. But what we found here was that the probability of social behavior nearly doubled in general when there were rarely sighted pods present. So we saw social behavior increase with a higher number of pods, but we also saw the social behavior increase with rarely sighted pods. So if we have pods that only show up once a year, once every 2 years, the social behavior was higher than if it was just a mix of unrelated pods that see each other all the time. So that was quite a fascinating find for us. And part of the importance of these calls that are indeed passed down through generation, learned from mother, learned from grandmother, and so on down the way. Want to at least give you the chance to hear a little bit of echolocation because it's pretty cool to imagine this signal going out from the forehead, bouncing off the swim bladder of a fish and returning to your lower jaw. And belugas are very good at this. They can shape their forehead like a lens, like zoom in your camera or something. Belugas can have the best echolocation of any of the cetaceans. Sperm whales have the loudest echolocation, and sometimes you hear echoes off the bottom in 700 feet of water. Actually, I got oh yeah, I have the sperm whale echolocation for you here. Oops, it decided to switch on me. Listen for the echo. That's a sperm whale's echolocation echoing off the bottom in 700 feet of water. Here's some killer whales calling. In fact, this same pod is Quinn here in the photo. And slow echolocation is for either navigation, keeping track of family members, or finding fish in the distance. And we also hear very fast echolocation when they're getting close to making the kill. And sometimes we hear a crunch at the end of it, where, you know, a lot of people want to call these animals orcas because they don't think they should be viewed as killers. But if you're a salmon trying to swim away, whew, bad news. Now this is cool. How many people are prepared to be blown away by cuteness? We know that these calls are passed down from mother to offspring, and it's been documented in captivity, but also for us out in the field, we found instances where we hear a call normally, like it's normally made, assume it's from a normal sized individual. And then we hear kind of a high squeaky short version of the call that we're pretty sure is made by a smaller individual, thus matching it's a calf. And we do hear this more when there are new calves around. So mom calling and the calf trying to mimic the call. And eventually, after a few months, they get it right. If that's not the cutest thing you've ever heard in the world, it's pretty darn amazing. But They get better at it. They learn the calls. One time in 2010 or so, I came across the AD pod, which we know very well. They were resting, so it was easy to photograph everybody, but the mom was missing. And I thought it quite odd, and she was missing for about 3 or 4 hours. She eventually came back. I think they got separated at an island, and this is really rare. These are very acoustically aware animals. They know where each other are at. And anyway, the mom was missing, and I heard these calls that were shortened versions, high-pitched versions, so I assumed it was a young one, and higher repetition, like more repetition in these calls than I'd ever heard ever. And feel free to throw in your chat box what you think this calf is shouting. No question in my mind, it's shouting out, "Mom!" And of course, you hate to anthropomorphize in science, but it is been noted by some of these authors, if anthropomorphization is only used to ask your questions, that's a good thing. It's only when we try and assign our human traits in making our conclusions that it's kind of a bad thing. So if we have animals that are swimming in family groups like ours for many, many years, there are some things that end up being quite similar. And lastly, to wrap up here, I just want to give you a chance to hear some biphonic calls. This is a call that has a low frequency bit and a high frequency bit. And listen for the whistle when you hear it the first time. You probably heard that whistle in the beginning. I'm going to play it one more time here, and now focus on the lower frequency bit. And what's cool about these calls, the high frequency bit, the whistle only goes forward. The low frequency bit goes all the way around. And so if a calf is listening to mom, with that, she knows if mom's facing her or away. And the relative intensity, those two signals lose energy at different rates. And in some calls are produced consistently at a higher energy, sometimes in the whistles. And so the calf would know how far away mom is, what direction she's pointing, and if she's accelerating or decelerating based on the Doppler effect. So tremendous amount of information coming from these biphonic calls, tremendous amount of information coming from echolocation. They would know if one of their family members had a broken rib or was pregnant. They would know if one of them had a fish in its mouth and wasn't sharing with a few echolocation clicks. So a tremendous acoustic world of awareness they have. To think in language, you really can't, because it's just so different from ours. But we're going to see some really fascinating research come out with these biphonic calls shortly. And lastly, I just want to recap. We see this cultural transmission in the diets, specific diets around the world. We see this cultural transmission in the rubbing beaches, in the favorite fishing holes, and we see it in all these calls that are passed down through generations. And for me, I find it completely fascinating. And I'm happy to answer any questions. You can find us on social media at Whales Alaska, hashtag Whales Alaska, and please do follow us and comment and check us out.
Thanks,
Bravo.
Dan. Awesome. I'll open it up to questions in just a second. There are a couple that popped up in the chat during the presentation, so I have 3. So I'll just ask you those right now, Dan. What about life expectancy for killer whales?
Yeah, this is super fascinating. Life expectancy for killer whales is about 40 to 50 years for males and about 60 to 80 for females. And we see that consistently in our population. Females living longer than males. People often ask why that is. And I think it's just, females have to live long to pass down this cultural knowledge and take care of their young, but not only their young, but their grand offspring. Whereas males of many species tend to do stupid and reckless things.
And we'll leave it at that. What about, okay, so there was a question about when you're finding whale poo, how do you know that it's from a killer whale and not from some other type of animal?
And I kind of noticed that question pop up, and I didn't want to break to go into question and answer mode for this time, but we do get the host DNA from the host animal. As well, over time, you know, these fecal samples dissipate fairly quickly, so it's really unlikely. We're following right behind the animal, so it's really unlikely that something would be floating from a different animal from, you know, hours before. And even if it did, it would have such a different signature in prey species that we'd probably notice it. But we do get the host DNA from each individual killer whale. Yep.
Okay, so you're just like watching them poo and then getting it.
That's disgusting.
Yep.
Come on.
Pretty much.
Should've known.
And then the last question that I saw come up in the chat is, what threats are there to killer whales? Is there anything that they have to worry about being rather, I mean, they're kind of top of the food chain, but.
Yeah, they are the top of the food chain. Really what we believe is, you know, juvenile and calf mortality, the first year is really tough for them. We see the most mortality in the youngest and the oldest. And for the youngest, we probably think it's lack of nutrition, lack of enough food to keep that expensive brain and expensive robust body moving. For the older ones, it's probably a combination of enough food to pack on blubber for the winter, but also they do eat in the winter. I don't mean to say they don't eat in the winter like humpbacks, been found with humpbacks, but they need some blubber to help get through the winter. And disease, certainly, contaminants and disease are certainly probably the biggest issue for them. Down in the San Juan Islands, those southern residents are having a really hard time, and lack of availability of Chinook salmon has been an issue. And but contaminants, it's really hard to separate out. There's a ton of boat traffic down there, contaminants. There's salmon habitat has been degraded in Washington, British Columbia, so it's a combination of all those things.
Do you see that last one on there, Dan? Someone just asking about plastics.
Yeah, really interestingly, in our fecal samples, we have somebody in the NOAA lab in Seattle who's been looking at microplastics in the scat. And interestingly, our Alaskan killer whales have been showing about similar amounts of microplastic as the Washington state animals. Plastics certainly would be a problem, and we are seeing microplastics in their feces. Some people were surprised that we had similar amounts as the Washington state animals, but of course they're eating salmon, and the salmon are roaming throughout the entire North Pacific, feeding, particularly in the Bering Sea and Aleutians. So yes, they're a problem. We're working on to find out how much of a problem they are, but it's probably not the defining problem between the southern residents and our Alaskan residents.
Hey, Dan, I have a question.
Yes.
With all of the time you've spent out on the water watching whales poop and such, I'm just wondering what your top kind of wildlife encounter stories, either with orcas or any other kind of wildlife on your field trips.
You're making that open to the top wildlife encounter all the way around the board?
Anything while you're out there, yeah.
In research or including Zegrahm trips?
I would say just research on your research.
Oh,
notes.
okay.
Yeah.
Well, there was this one time we were following the AT1 pod, the pod that, the mammal hunting pod, ones that swam through the oil spill. And we were trying to get photographs of all of them. So we we're getting in fairly close to 7 animals, all 7 that were remaining. Eventually the male broke off, swam towards us, jumped out of the water, and usually breaching whales land on their back or their side. He went up and over and in nose first, and when his tail came around, slapped the water and soaked the entire research boat. I was driving up on the flyboat. We had to shut windows and cover the cameras and like we were soaking. Just the amount of water that came over the boat was crazy. And that wouldn't have been so impressive by itself, but he swam away. This is a, 29-foot, 8-ton, 9-ton male, swam away, swam back, and did the exact same maneuver again and soaked us again.
Wow.
And we departed. We gave him some space.
That's cool. Thanks.
I see one more about pink color of calves. Sometimes they appear a little pinkish or orangish, the calves do, and it's, there's not a very conclusive answer, but it could be that, they're constantly shedding skin. They may have just a slightly different skin physiology. There's some good answers to that one online, but a lot of them are speculation. Some people have even speculated that their blubber layer is a little thinner, so blood vessels are more close to the surface of the skin, therefore seeing just a tinge of like almost a blushing face, so to speak. Yeah. Well, thank you, everybody. Can't wait for the
do you mind
chance.
exiting? Can you exit out of the share screen?
Oh yeah, sure can. Want me to leave it on that one, or do you want me to stop sharing?
Oh yeah, it's nice. It's a nice slide. We'll look at it momentarily. Now you can end it.
Okay.
That's beautiful.
Yeah. There we go. Good to see everybody. Gosh.
Oh,
Thanks, Dan. That was great.
Dan, it was terrific.
Yeah. So if anybody has questions, feel free to shout them out now. Dan is going to be leading a couple of Alaska National Parks trips next year, which look really awesome and maybe kind of more doable in times of COVID. We'll see how it's going.